Record. All right, folks, let's get this party started. I'm really excited to introduce y'all to Ford Evans. Ford Evans is their content expert that worked with us in the Dive for Ag project, highlighting aquaculture. So everything that you have probably seen in the aquaculture app would not have happened without Ford's knowledge on oysters and also the connections and highlighting the farms that we highlighted in the aquaculture app. So I'm really excited y'all get to, ask questions. As always, Christian Moore, if you are on this meeting live, you can always ask questions in the Q&A or chat. If you are watching the recording and you have questions after watching this, always send an email to diveforag@oregonstate.edu and we can get those questions answered that way as well. So I'm just handing it over to Ford.
All right, thank you. Okay, well, welcome everyone. I think what I might start out doing is just giving a definition of aquaculture. And Kristen, I guess can I share slides? Can I share screen?
Yes, you should be able to.
All right. Okay, bear with me. And can you see that? Okay. So I'll just get these pictures down here now. So first, I just want to give a definition of what aquaculture is. And this is a fairly simple definition. It was put out by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. And that is, aquaculture is the farming of aquatic organisms, including fish, mollusks, crustaceans, and aquatic plants. Pretty basic, but what's key in all of this is that there is some form of farmer intervention to enhance production. So there needs to be a farmer involved. And there also is some form of, typically, almost always, some form of ownership. So you'll own or lease a pond or a site where you can raise oysters and this type of thing. So this is to compare it to capture fisheries or fishing, basically when you go out into the ocean on a fishing boat and you're harvesting seafood that way. That's what we refer to as capture fisheries, and that's a very different sector. So aquaculture is in many ways just like agriculture. In fact, that was a political slogan back in the 80s or 90s, where aquaculture is agriculture. And just as agriculture is very diverse, plants and animals of all sorts of intensities and levels of production, that's the same with aquaculture, globally speaking. So on the left, I just have a couple pictures of freshwater systems. So this is probably a catfish pond and freshwater. We have, estuaries, so bays along the coast. And this is a shot of Tillamook Bay in Oregon. They're harvesting oysters. And then other places like this salmon net pen is in a fully marine environment in the open ocean. Probably somewhere in Norway is my guess there. So freshwater, brackish water, marine, water, salt water, all of that, aquaculture happens in all of those environments. Also different levels of farmer intervention. So here, if you're, I don't know if you can see that, let me do this. If you're a oyster farmer, you have your mud flat that you're leasing, you just put out oyster shells, and I'm simplifying a little bit here, but basically you put your baby oysters out on their shells and essentially let them grow for the next couple of years. There is some attention you do need to give to them, but basically Mother Nature is providing all of the food and the seawater, maintaining water quality, so flushing water in and out and so forth. The farmer isn't really involved in that, for better or for worse. There's some things the farmers may want to change, but they're just at the whim of nature, so they can't change it. Compare that to, here's a picture of a very intense recirculating system. This is an indoor system. And in this case, the farmer is in control, has a lot of intervention. So the farmer's control basically of all aspects of life support here. So the water, providing the water in the first place, water quality, oxygen in the water, the farmer has to provide the food, has to deal with the waste, all these sorts of things. So two very different levels of intervention. And then the last comparison I'd make in terms of the different kinds of systems that we end up seeing is one is, again, this indoor system, a lot of intervention, but also a lot of capital investment in the system. A lot of tanks, everything is purchased. Mother Nature really isn't involved at all. Compare that to more of a subsistence operation where this is a freshwater pond. It may have been even hand dug and probably providing some locally made feed to their fish here. So again, very different levels of capital investment and intensities of production and all these things. So my point being, aquaculture is a very, very diverse industry. And this, I had to show pictures of some other animals, so I threw this in here. Don't worry too much about the table here, but one thing to note, again, this is the UN who puts out, this is 2017, total global production of the top 10 species here, and the top 3 are species that we don't even think about here in the US. If you say aquaculture to someone in the US, they probably think salmon, maybe oysters, shrimp, tilapia, catfish, these types of things. But on a global scale, it's actually carp and 2 forms of seaweed. Both, all 3 of these things we really don't consume here in the US, though there are some people trying to change the improve seaweed consumption here in the US. This, again, from a global perspective, there's a lot going on in aquaculture. A lot of it is happening overseas, not in the United States. Here's a picture of a carp, which you probably won't see too much of in the markets. Tilapia, catfish, these are a bit more common. And apologies for all these charts and figures, but I did want to show one. This is sort of a famous aquaculture graph that you'll see in many, many aquaculture talks. Along the y-axis here, you have global seafood production. And along the x-axis here, along the bottom, you have time, and this is just the year. And then 2 different color schemes here. The orangish reddish are the total seafood production that comes from the capture fisheries, or the boats going out to sea, for example, and harvesting fish. And then you see the production that you can that's attributable to aquaculture, either freshwater or marine aquaculture systems. And a couple things to point out here is one, in about the late 1980s, you see this plateau in the amount of production that's coming from capture fisheries. So although fishers are trying, they're just not able to pull more seafood out of the ocean. Many of the marine stocks are either overexploited or at their maximum sustainable yield. So there's really no way to sustainably pull more fish out of those fisheries. There is, however, increasing demand for seafood, and it's aquaculture that you can see from about the late 80s on that's really meeting this increased demand in seafood. And the second point I'd make here, this is a little bit dated, but over, you don't see it here, this is about half and half, but now it's over half of the total global seafood production is coming from aquaculture. That, of course, what is that, 50, 40 years ago, it was a very different story. And this doesn't include seaweed, which isn't consumed too much here in the United States, but in Asia, it's a major aquaculture product. And you could, if we want to include seaweed, we'd tack on another 30 million tons up at the top there. So aquaculture is very important, certainly on a global scheme. If we bring this down to the United States and Oregon, what's going on here? The United States is not a very big player in terms of global production of aquaculture. And Oregon, unfortunately, is probably below average in terms of it being an aquaculture state in terms of sales. But when we do zoom in on Oregon, we can see that the vast majority of sales of aquaculture products in Oregon is attributed to mollusks. And the mollusk that we're actually talking about here that fills up most of this 84% is the Pacific oyster. And that is what the app is based on, largely because it is one of the main aquaculture products here in the state of Oregon. And I also just want to mention there are other ways that, well, there's other parts of Oregon. It's not just the coast. There's the inland areas, there's rural areas, there's urban areas. And this is just another system that I wanted to highlight because actually there is a farm that's currently up and running in a very urban environment in Portland. And it uses this technology or production system that's referred to aquaponics. And that's basically a system where you feed fish in a tank. They excrete their waste as ammonia that, with the help of some bacteria, get converted into nitrates that can be taken up by plants. And this effectively filters the water that is then returned back to the fish tank. So you have this nice recirculating system. And it is scalable. There's very small systems. I had one in my backyard for a little while. And here's a picture of a very large commercial scale. I think this is basil, which I think is one of their favorite things to produce. But you can produce other things. Here's a variety of plant species there. And I bring this up because there actually is a large aquaponics farm in Portland or Milwaukee, Live Local Organics, and I recommend having a look at their website for some photos. But you walk up to it. Here's our 1,400 square foot warehouse, and you wouldn't think there's a fish farm in there. Fish, I will confess, play a minor role here. They get most of their income from the basil that they end up selling in other herbs. But it's the same system. Fresh water, comes in here from the nutrient-rich water that's in the fish tank. So that is one form of aquaculture. It's a combination of aquaculture and agriculture that is existing in the urban environment. So I wanted to throw that out there. Just in the Oregon context, it's not just oysters. And then we can talk about oysters, but Chris, I don't know if you want to shift gears, or should I continue on?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that you highlighted some aquaponics culture. So like if somebody wanted to get something started, are there like certain plants that are more suitable for like aquaponics? Do you know?
Yeah, so the plants, it depends on where your aquaponics system is. I'll give you an example of what I ended up doing. I had an old garden shed that I took the roof off and put some greenhouse plastic over the top. And I ended up growing goldfish because they're super easy. I wasn't going to eat any of them. And my daughter wouldn't let me eat any fish, I'm sure, that we grew. So I did goldfish, and they were there just to produce waste to feed the plants. Where my garden shed was, unfortunately, was very shady. So my choice of plants in this case turned out to be shade-loving plants. And I sort of backed away from food production altogether. It's a little upsetting, but I ended up doing ferns and other things like that. So I was in it more for the heady academic, and it was a fun hobby to do, and is fun, and it can be done on a very small scale. There, if you go online, there are very small kits that you can set up in your living room. There's also kits you can buy to sort of start your own pilot farm if you want to go commercial. Anyways, a super fun idea and a fun hobby if you want to take the next step.
One thing I thought was really cool is that you highlighted other things that aquaculture can produce. I'm curious because I don't know anything about seaweed. Like what sort of system and like, are there seaweed farms in Oregon?
Yeah, well, I shouldn't say it so matter-of-factly, but there is one. And there are actually two ways of growing, of farming. Well, there's many ways to grow it, but in the United States, there's something called sugar kelp. And that is a species, it's a kelp, a very large algae, macroalgae. And that is grown on long lines. And I had a picture of it on a slide earlier representing seaweed. But here and that can be done. It can be mechanized, sort of not automated, but mechanized anyways. And they can actually produce a lot of biomass that way. What happens here in Oregon, so to do that, let me back up a little bit, to do this sugar kelp model, you do need structure in the water. You need these long lines in the water to suspend the kelp from, and that's where it grows, which is very difficult to do in many places. You need protected water and permitting. You need to have permission to put structures out in the ocean. In Oregon, there is one oyster farm, and it's Oregon Seaweed, and they're actually land-based. So they are located very close to the water. They have two sites, one in Garibaldi, which is sort of the northern part of Tillamook Bay, and one in Southern Oregon in Bandon. They have another 8 or 10 tanks down there. What they end up doing is they have these very large tanks that they pump in seawater. They aerate it heavily, so they basically inject air into the bottom, and that ends up tumbling the seaweed that they keep in the tanks. And the seaweed that they're growing is dulse. It's a red seaweed. Again, feel free to Google Pacific dulse because I want to say maybe 10 years ago, maybe less, it went viral because word got out that it tasted like bacon. And it was, people heralded it as the miracle food seaweed, that healthy food that tastes like bacon. It doesn't taste 100% like bacon. That's the problem. But it has, it hints of notes of bacon in there. And I've actually made it before. Well, I've some of the stuff that we had at the coast, and I've essentially rinsed off the salt, a little bit of oil, put it in the oven, and it ends up tasting a lot like sort of bacon bits, but sort of the more burnt side of things. It's not bad, actually. It's quite good as a seasoning. So anyways, I should be plugging it much more than I am. I do quite a bit of research with dulse at the coast, trying to optimize ways to grow it in land-based tanks. And I guess one other thing that dulse, the seaweed, can be used for is food for other aquaculture species. And something that we're looking at now is raising dulse on land and also sea urchins, so fattening sea urchins. There's a lot of backstory there on why that has to happen, but that's tied in with the disappearance of kelp off the coast. The urchins out there don't have much food to eat. Their marketability depends on how it's referred to as uni. It's essentially their roe, their eggs. They need to be very ripe and plump to be marketable, and they're just not that way off the coast here. So bring those empty urchins in, feed them on dulse, fatten them up, and then they can be sold in local, and we'll see where they end up getting sold. But there is a historic urchin fisheries historically along the Oregon coast, so it's could tap into that as well. So
awesome. One thing that the app really does a great job explaining is how oysters are produced. But I think how oysters usually touch a lot of people's lives is if they eat it. I'm just curious, like, what is your favorite way to prepare oysters?
I like them raw. I actually also like them barbecued, which is a good way to do it as well. But I think maybe also my academic approach to all this, I really enjoy tasting the different kinds of oysters. Oftentimes you can get them at a single restaurant, you can get them from a variety of locations, and it's fun to see how they differ in taste. Different species also can taste very different. There's a native oyster, which you which may be difficult to find in restaurants, but there's also a European oyster that has a very metallic flavor. And so it's interesting to see how these different species taste.
Yeah, I think that would be like a really cool pin if somebody was looking for an idea of just like the culinary aspect, like different ways to prepare it, or the sizes, how that influences taste, or the different types of oysters. That would be a cool one. And the other thing that I had another team kind of mention, and we didn't talk about this at all in the app, we focused more on like the meat production, is what if somebody wanted to talk about oysters that produce pearls? Where does that happen? Is that a whole separate species of oysters?
Reliably, it's a whole different species of oysters. I say reliably because I think anything can happen with an oyster. There may be a very low quality pearl. It is the oyster responding to a irritant in its shell that makes the oysters. It sort of that makes the pearls. Sorry, where that typically happens is in places like Indonesia or the Philippines or the Pacific Islands. A completely different species. But that would be a fun one to do in terms of developing an app. A whole science and process devoted. What they end up doing is seeding oysters, and seeding means you're putting it's essentially the irritant that the oyster is responding to, then it lays down it's the pearl shell on top of it to try to encapsulate the irritant, and they refer to that as a nucleus and all that. So all pearls often will have some non-pearl core to them in the middle. But yeah, no, a fascinating industry, and it would be a fantastic field trip too if anyone can make it to Tahiti or someplace. But yeah, the other thing about eating oysters, a tidbit, and I don't know if we included this in the oyster app, but that they are one of the few animals that are eaten live. I don't know if we included that as a
I don't think
strange.
we really did too much. But yeah, so like so I guess some people may know oysters as like oysters on a half shell. So then if you're removing half of a shell, how is an oyster still alive technically then when you eat it?
Yeah, I mean, it's they can actually live for some time with their shells closed, and of course they're not growing, they're not feeding, but that is the sort of state that if you were to take a live oyster, shuck it, and consume it, it would still be alive. And I don't know how deep we want to, if this is too dreary of a topic, but still be functioning. And in fact, there's, in terms of labs and demonstrations and that in classes, sometimes that is a way to see how, to illustrate how oysters pull water in with their gills to help move water, and you can actually see dye, go through the animal. So it's still alive, still kicking for the time being. But it's not always on the half shell. It can also be, in some cases, processed to some degree as well. There's pressure treatments that that can be applied to. Although it looks raw, it has been basically, it's a food safety issue. You can get some of the bacteria, treat some of the bacteria that way, get rid of it. But
okay. One other like thread I think I've heard some teams are going down with aquaculture is they found it really fascinating that oysters, to raise them, it's really delicious, their food. But there's also a benefit to the environment and ecosystem raising oysters. And so that filtering, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit of how oysters, just with their biology, can filter seawater.
Yeah. Yeah, well, they are filter feeders, and it's actually a fascinating process that how they eat. Um, they actually create a current through their body with cilia, with little hair on their gills, and they can capture small particles on their gills, and then you can actually see a little food particle if you're looking closely enough, track along the gill and then down into its mouth to be consumed. Um, the urchin, excuse me, the oyster can also sort out items that are not food and not ingested, but they will push that off to the side, and that's referred to as pseudo feces. That's came into the shell. The oyster got a hold of it, determined that it wasn't a good food source, and then can reject it before it consumes it. So in the process of doing that, they actually end up pulling a lot of water uh, through their shells. And I didn't show a picture of a reef. I don't think so, but these animals naturally aggregate in reefs, and so you have a lot of oysters filtering a lot of water, and that can end up taking nutrients essentially out of the water and then depositing it on the bottom. So it helps clean water, heavily um, eutrophic water, and it can help improve water quality that way. There is some carbon that also gets sequestered into the shell. That is a little bit balanced with respiration that's going on with the urchin. So I think some people are still trying to figure out the balance of how beneficial they may or may not be for carbon sequestration. But the shell is great calcium, a great calcium sink, so carbon sink.
Sweet. Well, I think some of the things we touched on would be really just cool pins. I don't know if anybody that is live on the webinar have any questions, any ideas. I'll give it a little bit, but those are probably the main threads that I've heard from teams.
Yeah.
Which I think would be really cool routes to go.
Right. I mean, there is a lot of aquaculture out there, so very diverse industry, so lots to pick from.
Yeah, and we just picked oysters. We just did one.
Yep.
That would be really cool to.
This is just one.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. I think
okay.
We do have one. Oh, awesome. Okay. Is there anything endangering oysters today?
Interesting. Oysters are surprisingly hardy. There are, that's not always the case though. So there are, and it depends on the species. I'll just mention two things. One is the notion of habitat. These animals need a relatively clean, firm substrate to affix to. We didn't go into the larval life cycle. You all may have seen that in the app, but they start their lives out as free swimming larvae in the water column, and then they'll bounce more or less up and down. About 2 weeks old, 2-3 weeks old, they'll bounce up and down, sort of bouncing off the bottom, looking for a suitable place to set. And when they find it, they affix to that, and that's essentially where they stay for the rest of their lives. There, however, needs to be firm, clean substrate. And what was found early on with the oyster fisheries on the East Coast and on the West Coast here too, is people were harvesting oysters, taking the meat, consuming the meat, and then taking the shells and doing something else with them, paving roads or who knows what with it. But the shells, importantly, were not going back into the ocean. And that is actually part of the long-term life cycle of these animals. They develop a reef, and then that hard substrate helps recruit future generations. So, and that's actually one issue as well that they're seeing with the native oyster here in Oregon, is there needs to be suitable substrate for the native oyster to set on. The other thing I'd mention is with Pacific oysters, since we're talking about aquaculture, Pacific oysters are the sort of the #1 cultured species around the world. And there is, of all things, a herpes virus that is has infected some stocks with sort of catastrophic results where they get near complete mortalities and 100% mortality in some of the oyster beds. People are working on trying to develop tolerant or resistant strains, trying to come up with management strategies about how to sort of manage around this disease. But that is something that the oyster industry on the West Coast is actually quite concerned about and tracking. A side note on that, which is interesting, I gave some presentations on this work pre-COVID, and I had to explain a virus and there can be variants and all this sort of stuff. But nowadays, people speak the language. So I think you know what I'm saying. This herpes virus started out as a fairly benign virus in Europe, but it has since mutated, and there are now new variants that are out there that are more pathogenic. And that's really causing concern in the industry. So, yeah.
Good question. I didn't even know that. So thanks for asking that. Okay, folks, another webinar. So hopefully if you're thinking about aquaculture, this gives you some ideas or it's bringing up more questions, which, if you're diving into any topic that you're learning new things about, that totally is normal. So feel free to always send us emails at diveforag@oregonstate.edu and we'll make sure that your questions get answered. But we're really excited to see what y'all make. Thank you for your time, Ford.
All right.
Attending live.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.